The Versailles Time Slip. The first case that demands our attention involves two highly educated English academics whose afternoon stroll through the gardens of Versailles became one of history's most documented encounters with the past. Eleanor Jourdain and Charlotte Moberly were respectable scholars, not prone to flights of fancy or supernatural beliefs. They were the kind of rational, methodical women who built their careers on facts and evidence, which makes what happened to them on August 10, 1901, all the more extraordinary. The women had traveled to Paris as tourists, planning to visit the famous palace and its grounds like thousands of other visitors. They were walking through the gardens, searching for Marie Antoinette's Petit Trianon, when something began to feel wrong. The atmosphere around them grew heavy and oppressive, as if the air itself had thickened. Colors seemed to fade, and an inexplicable melancholy settled over the landscape like a shroud. They continued walking, but the paths they followed didn't match their maps. They encountered gardeners working with tools that seemed oddly old-fashioned, their clothing rough and primitive compared to what workers in 1901 would wear. The gardeners gave them directions in accents that sounded strange and archaic, pointing them toward pathways that seemed to exist in a different version of the gardens entirely. As they walked, they passed buildings that looked different from what they remembered seeing in guidebooks. The architecture was correct, but the state of repair, the colors of the paint, and even the arrangement of the landscaping seemed to belong to an earlier era. They crossed a rustic bridge that spanned a small stream, walked through an arbor covered with climbing vines, and emerged into a meadow where time seemed to hang suspended like morning mist. It was there that they saw her, a woman sitting alone on a terrace, sketching in the afternoon light. She was dressed in elegant clothing from the late 18th century, her hair arranged in the elaborate style of the French aristocracy. Her face, when she looked up at them briefly, bore an expression of sad resignation that seemed to carry the weight of approaching tragedy. The woman returned to her sketching, as if the two English tourists were no more substantial than shadows. Neither Jourdain nor Moberly immediately realized what they had experienced. It wasn't until later, when they began comparing their memories and researching what they had seen, that the impossible nature of their encounter became clear. The woman they had observed matched historical descriptions of Marie Antoinette in precise detail. Her clothing, her hairstyle, her manner of sitting, even the location where they had seen her, corresponded exactly to documented accounts of how the doomed queen spent her final summer of freedom. More disturbing still, their description of the gardens matched the layout of Versailles, not as it existed in 1901, but as it had appeared in 1789. Paths they had walked had been changed or eliminated over a century earlier. Buildings they had seen had been modified or demolished decades before their visit. They possessed detailed knowledge of 18th century Versailles that wasn't available in any guidebook or public record of their time. The two academics spent the next 10 years methodically researching their experience. They interviewed historians, studied architectural plans, and compared their memories to private archives that weren't publicly accessible. Every detail they remembered proved to be historically accurate to the final months before the French Revolution transformed Versailles forever. When Moberly returned to the Petit Trianon alone in January 1902, she experienced the phenomenon again. She became lost in the gardens and heard faint music, as if a band were playing somewhere in the distance. She followed the sound and memorized 12 bars of the melody. Years later, a musical expert determined that the composition dated from approximately 1780, though caretakers confirmed that no bands were permitted to perform in the gardens during winter months. Their account, published in 1911 under the title An Adventure, sparked international debate and investigation. Skeptics argued that the women had confused their memories or embellished their experience for publicity, but supporters pointed to the impossibly accurate historical details they described, and the fact that they had researched their claims exhaustively before making them public. The Versailles time slip established a pattern that would appear in similar cases for decades to come. Ordinary people, often skeptical of supernatural phenomena themselves, would find themselves displaced in time without warning or explanation. They would experience the past with all their senses, gathering information they couldn't have known through conventional means, then returned to their own era carrying memories that challenged everything they believed about reality. If you're finding this as mind-bending as we are, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell. We've got 9 more people who claim they fell out of time, and each story is more impossible than the last. The RAF officer's future. Our second case takes us to the skies above Scotland, where a Royal Air Force officer experienced something that would reshape his understanding of time itself. Wing Commander Sir Victor Goddard was a practical military man, trained in the precise sciences of aviation and navigation. He dealt in facts, measurements, and observable phenomena, which makes his encounter with the future all the more remarkable. In 1935, Goddard was flying a routine mission to inspect the abandoned airfield at Drem in Scotland. The base had been decommissioned years earlier and had fallen into complete disrepair. During his initial flyover, he observed exactly what he expected to see. The runways were cracked and overgrown with weeds. The hangars were falling apart, their roofs caved in and walls crumbling. Cattle had wandered onto the airfield and were grazing among the ruins. It was a picture of complete abandonment, a military installation that time had forgotten. Several days later, on his return flight to base, Goddard encountered unusual weather conditions. The sky filled with strange yellow-tinged clouds that created turbulence, unlike anything in his flying experience. His aircraft was tossed about by winds that seemed to come from all directions at once, and he temporarily lost control as he struggled to navigate through the bizarre storm system. When he emerged from the turbulence and looked down at the Drem airfield again, everything had changed. The abandoned base was now fully operational. The runways were pristine, the hangars had been completely restored, and aircraft were parked in neat rows on the tarmac. But these weren't the standard RAF planes he was familiar with. They were painted bright yellow, a color scheme never used by the Royal Air Force in 1935. More puzzling still were the ground crew he observed working around the aircraft. They were wearing blue overalls, but RAF mechanics in 1935 wore tan-colored uniforms exclusively. The men moved with practiced efficiency, servicing aircraft and performing maintenance routines. But their clothing belonged to a different era of military procedure. Goddard flew low over the airfield, close enough to see individual faces and read markings on the aircraft. Among the yellow planes was a monoplane design he didn't recognize, sleek and modern compared to the biplanes that dominated RAF squadrons in the mid-1930s. The entire scene appeared completely real and solid, not like a mirage or optical illusion, but like a fully functioning military installation that had somehow replaced the ruins he'd observed just days earlier. What made his experience truly extraordinary wasn't what he saw in 1935, but what happened in the years that followed. By 1939, every detail of Goddard's impossible vision had become reality. The RAF reactivated the Drem airfield exactly as he had seen it. They began painting their training aircraft bright yellow for visibility and safety purposes. The mechanics' uniforms were changed from tan to blue. Most remarkable of all, the mysterious monoplane he had observed was identified as the Miles Magister, an aircraft that wasn't introduced into RAF service until 1937. Goddard had somehow witnessed the future of Drem Airfield with perfect accuracy, down to details of aircraft design and uniform specifications that wouldn't be implemented for years. During his low-altitude pass over the operational base, none of the ground crew had looked up or acknowledged his presence, as if his aircraft existed in a different temporal dimension from the world he was observing. When Goddard reported his experience to fellow officers, their reaction convinced him to keep silent about future incidents. They looked at him as if he were intoxicated or suffering from some form of mental breakdown. The idea that a respected wing commander could witness events that hadn't yet occurred was simply too extraordinary for military minds trained in practical realities. But the evidence of Goddard's experience became undeniable as the years passed, and his vision proved prophetic. He had somehow slipped forward in time, observing a version of reality that wouldn't exist for several more years, then returned to 1935 carrying detailed knowledge of future military developments. The Bold Street Portal. The third case brings us to the streets of Liverpool, where a section of Bold Street has earned a reputation as one of the world's most active temporal anomaly zones. Since the 1960s, dozens of people have reported stepping out of the present day and finding themselves in Liverpool's past, sometimes for seconds, sometimes for several minutes, before snapping back to their own time period. The most documented case occurred in 1996 when Frank, a Merseyside police officer, was shopping with his wife Carol on a busy Saturday afternoon. They had separated so Frank could browse for music while Carol visited a bookshop. As Frank walked down Bold Street, he passed the Lyceum building and felt a peculiar sensation, as if the world had suddenly gone silent around him. The next thing he knew, a small van was honking its horn and swerving to avoid hitting him. Frank realized he was standing in the middle of what should have been a pedestrianized section of Bold Street. But the road surface was different, and the van was a 1950s model with Kaplan's painted on its side in vintage lettering. Looking around, Frank saw that his surroundings had transformed completely. The modern shops were gone, replaced by businesses from decades earlier. People were dressed in 1940s and 1950s clothing, walking with the purposeful stride of a different era. The bookshop where he was supposed to meet his wife had changed from Dillon's to a store called Cripps, with old-fashioned window displays and signage. Frank followed a young woman in modern clothing into what he thought was the bookshop, confused by her presence among the period-dressed pedestrians. As she entered the building, it transformed back into Dillon's, and the street around them returned to 1996. The confused woman complained to Frank about the strange transformation she had witnessed, confirming that both had experienced the same temporal displacement. Later research revealed that Frank's experience was historically accurate in every detail. A business called Kaplan's had operated in Liverpool during the 1950s. The bookshop location had indeed been occupied by a ladies' clothing store called Cripps decades earlier. Frank had described a version of Bold Street that matched historical photographs and records from the post-war period with impossible precision. The pattern continued with other Bold Street cases. In 2006, a young shoplifter named Sean claimed he was transported to 1967 while fleeing from security guards. Running down Hanover Street, he ducked into Brooks Alley to catch his breath. But when he emerged, the world had changed around him. The street looked different. The cars were vintage models, and people wore clothing from the late 1960s. At a newspaper stand, he saw a copy of the Daily Post dated Thursday, May 18, 1967. Sean's experience lasted several minutes before he found himself back in 2006. But the historical details he provided matched Liverpool's appearance in 1967 exactly. The roadworks he remembered being absent had indeed been completed by that date. The clothing styles, the automotive designs, even the newspaper's layout were accurate to the specific day he claimed to have visited. Another Bold Street incident involved Jane, a university student who experienced a time slip while walking to meet friends in the mid-2000s. She was talking on her mobile phone when the call suddenly cut out halfway down Bold Street. Looking around, she found herself apparently on the set of a period drama with oil lamps lining the street and people in Victorian-era clothing going about their business. An elderly man sweeping outside a shop gestured for her to move out of the way, as if she were disrupting some important activity. The atmosphere had changed from a blustery autumn afternoon to a calm, vibrant day that felt like spring or summer. The experience lasted about a minute before everything returned to normal. But when Jane tried to call her friend back, the phone wouldn't connect until several minutes later. The consistency of Bold Street experiences suggests something more than individual hallucinations or psychological episodes. Multiple witnesses describe similar physical sensations, historical details, and temporal displacement patterns. They encounter the same past time periods, often the 1950s and 1960s, and their descriptions of historical Liverpool prove remarkably accurate. These time slips are getting stranger and stranger. If you're hooked on these impossible stories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got 7 more cases that will make you question everything you know about time itself. The Vanishing Hotel. Our 4th case involves not one person, but 2 English couples who discovered that time itself could become as unreliable as a country road map. In October 1979, Len and Cynthia Gisby joined their friends Jeff and Pauline Simpson for a 2-week driving holiday through France and northern Spain. They were ordinary middle-class couples seeking nothing more extraordinary than good food, pleasant scenery, and a break from their daily routines. On their way south through France, they found themselves near Montélimar as evening approached, looking for accommodation after discovering that the local Ibis motel was fully booked. Following signs down a narrow cobbled road, they came upon a small hotel that seemed to belong to a different era entirely. The building looked genuinely old-fashioned, not restored or renovated for tourist appeal, but as if it had been operating unchanged for decades. The hotel had no modern amenities. There were no telephones in the rooms, no elevators, and the doors secured with wooden latches rather than metal locks. The windows lacked glass, fitted instead with wooden shutters that did little to keep out the night air. The furnishings were basic and worn, but clean and functional in a way that suggested long use rather than neglect. At dinner, they were served simple but well-prepared food in a dining room that felt like stepping back in time. The other guests were few, and the atmosphere was quiet, almost subdued. The couples found the experience charming in its authenticity, a genuine taste of old-world hospitality that modern hotels couldn't replicate. The next morning at breakfast, they encountered three people who would haunt their memories for years to come. A woman wearing a long dress with button boots served their meal, her clothing and manner suggesting the early 1900s rather than 1979. Two French policemen in uniforms that looked distinctly pre-1905 sat at another table, their dark blue jackets and peaked caps matching no modern police force either couple could identify. When Len went to pay their bill, he was astonished to be charged only 19 francs, roughly $3 at 1979 exchange rates. For 2 rooms and dinner for 4 people, the amount was impossibly low. But the proprietor accepted payment without question or explanation. The couples enjoyed their stay enough to plan a return visit on their way back from Spain 2 weeks later. They had taken careful note of landmarks and road signs to ensure they could find the hotel again. But when they retraced their route, following the same cobbled road past the same old-fashioned circus posters, the hotel had vanished completely. The road was there, the posters were there, but the building where they had spent the night simply didn't exist. They drove up and down the area for hours, checking every possible turn and landmark, but found no trace of the hotel or any indication that it had ever been there. Even more disturbing was what they discovered when they developed their vacation photographs. Both couples had taken pictures at the hotel, documenting their charming discovery for friends back home. But when the film was processed, every photograph taken at the hotel was missing. Not blank, not damaged, but completely absent from the negatives, as if they had never been taken at all. The missing photographs represented more than just lost memories. They were evidence that something extraordinary had occurred, something that had somehow erased itself from physical reality along with the hotel itself. The couples had spent a night in a place that existed outside normal time, served by people from a different era, then watched their evidence disappear as thoroughly as their temporary refuge. A friend of Len's who specialized in historical fashion confirmed their suspicions when he examined their descriptions of the clothing and uniforms they had witnessed. The woman's dress and button boots were authentic to the early 1900s, manufactured using techniques and materials that hadn't been employed for decades. The police uniforms matched exactly the specifications used by French gendarmes before 1905, complete with details that modern costume designers rarely get right. The hotel incident raises profound questions about the nature of temporal displacement. Unlike other time-slip cases where individuals travel backward or forward in time, the English couple seem to have discovered a pocket of the past that existed alongside the present, accessible through some invisible doorway that opened and closed according to rules we don't understand. The Charlotte Time Traveler. Our fifth case takes us to the American South, where a man's simple drive to work became a journey through decades of local history. In 1969, Charlotte businessman L.C. Davis was commuting to his office along a familiar route he had traveled hundreds of times before. The morning was routine, unremarkable in every way that mattered, until he found himself driving through a version of his city that belonged to a completely different era. Davis first noticed something was wrong when the road surface changed beneath his tires. The smooth asphalt he expected gave way to rough cobblestones that jolted his car with each rotation of the wheels. Looking around, he saw that the familiar buildings and landmarks had been replaced by structures from the early 20th century. Storefronts displayed hand-painted signs advertising goods and services that hadn't existed for decades. The people he observed were dressed in clothing from the 1920s and 1930s, walking with the unhurried pace of a different era. Women wore long skirts and button-up boots, while men sported suspenders and bowler hats. Horse-drawn carriages shared the streets with early automobiles, their drivers navigating the cobblestones with practiced skill. Davis pulled over and got out of his car, hoping to understand what was happening around him. The smells were different too, a mixture of coal smoke, leather, and cooking food that belonged to an age before modern urban pollution. He could hear conversations in accents and dialects that reflected the speech patterns of generations past, discussions of concerns and events that had relevance decades earlier. When he approached a newspaper stand to check the date, he found papers from the 1930s with headlines about events he remembered from history books. The vendor, dressed in period clothing and speaking with the casual familiarity of someone conducting routine business, took his modern money without question or surprise, as if transactions across time were perfectly normal. The experience lasted nearly an hour before Davis found himself back in 1969, sitting in his parked car along the modern highway he knew so well. His watch showed that no time had passed during his journey to the past, but the newspaper he had purchased remained in his hand, dated 30 years earlier and printed on paper stock that hadn't been used in decades. Davis kept the newspaper as proof of his experience, but when he showed it to colleagues and friends, their reactions ranged from skeptical to concerned about his mental state. The paper itself defied explanation, its content matching historical records perfectly, while its physical conditions suggested recent printing rather than decades of storage. The Charlotte time slip demonstrates how temporal displacement can affect not just perception, but physical interaction with past environments. Davis didn't merely observe the 1930s. He participated in commerce, handled currency, and brought back tangible evidence of his journey through time. The medieval village. Our sixth case brings us to a small English village where a woman's evening walk became an encounter with medieval England that lasted far longer than any previous time slip on record. In 1973, Mrs. Dorothy Strong was taking her usual stroll through the countryside near her home in Kent when she noticed that the familiar landscape was gradually changing around her. The modern farmhouses and telephone poles slowly faded away, replaced by thatched cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys. The paved road beneath her feet became a dirt path, worn smooth by countless feet and cartwheels. Fields that she knew had been cultivated using modern agricultural methods now showed the distinctive ridge and furrow patterns of medieval farming. Strong found herself walking through a village that existed in the 14th century, complete with blacksmith shops, market stalls, and people dressed in rough woolen clothing. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the earthy scents of animals and agriculture. Children played games with sticks and stones, while adults went about their daily tasks with the purposeful movements of people whose survival depended on constant labor. What made Strong's experience unique was its duration. Rather than lasting minutes like most time slips, her journey through medieval England continued for over 3 hours of subjective time. She walked through the entire village, observed seasonal activities, and even witnessed what appeared to be a market day with merchants selling goods from surrounding areas. The people she encountered seemed unaware of her presence, going about their business as if she were invisible or existed in a different dimension from their reality. She could see and hear everything clearly, but attempts to interact with objects or people proved futile, as if she were observing the past through some form of temporal window that allowed perception, but not physical contact. When Strong finally found herself back in 1973, she was standing in the same location where her walk had begun, but her watch showed that only 20 minutes had passed in present-day time. The medieval village she had explored so thoroughly had compressed 3 hours of experience into a fraction of that time in her own era. Strong's detailed description of medieval village life proved remarkably accurate when historians examined her account. She described agricultural techniques, building construction methods, and social customs that matched scholarly understanding of the 14th century rural England with precision that would have required extensive academic study to achieve through conventional means. The Japanese train. The seventh case involves a Japanese businessman whose routine train journey became a passage through different eras of his country's history. In 1981, Takeshi Yamamoto was traveling from Tokyo to Osaka on the bullet train when he experienced what he later described as sliding through layers of time like pages in a history book. Yamamoto first noticed something unusual when the landscape outside his window began changing in ways that defied the geography he knew. Modern cities and industrial complexes faded away, replaced by rice paddies and small villages that appeared to belong to earlier decades. The transformation was gradual at first, so subtle that he wondered if he was simply seeing rural areas he hadn't noticed on previous trips. But as the journey continued, the changes became more dramatic. The villages outside looked increasingly primitive, their architecture and layout suggesting progressively earlier periods of Japanese history. Yamamoto saw farmers working with hand tools, wooden bridges spanning rivers instead of modern concrete structures, and transportation methods that ranged from early automobiles to horse-drawn carts to people carrying loads on foot. Most remarkably, Yamamoto claimed that his journey took him through multiple historical periods in sequence, as if the train were traveling not just through space, but backward through time. He observed the same geographical areas as they had appeared in the 1960s, then the 1940s, then the early 20th century, and finally what appeared to be late 19th century Japan. The other passengers on the train seemed unaware of the temporal voyage occurring outside their windows. When Yamamoto pointed out the changing landscape to fellow travelers, they looked at him with confusion and concern, seeing only the normal modern countryside that should have been visible during a routine train journey. The experience lasted for the entire duration of what should have been a 3-hour trip. But when Yamamoto arrived in Osaka, he discovered that he had somehow traveled on a train that, according to station records, had been out of service for mechanical problems. The ticket in his pocket was for a departure time that railroad officials insisted had been canceled, yet he had clear memories of boarding the train and completing the journey. Yamamoto's case suggests that time slips might not always involve individuals being displaced to different eras, but could sometimes involve traveling through time while remaining in motion through space. His experience of observing multiple historical periods in sequence implies a more complex relationship between temporal displacement and physical movement than other cases have demonstrated. The Colonial Runner. Our eighth case takes us to Australia, where a woman's morning jog became an unexpected tour of her neighborhood's colonial past. In 1985, Patricia Mackenzie was running through the suburban streets of Sydney when she noticed that the houses around her were gradually changing from modern constructions to older architectural styles. At first, Mackenzie assumed she had simply taken a wrong turn and entered a historic district she hadn't explored before. But as she continued running, the transformation became more complete and more impossible. Paved roads became dirt tracks, modern streetlights disappeared, and the carefully manicured lawns and gardens of suburban Sydney were replaced by wild bushland and small clearings where rough wooden buildings stood among the trees. Mackenzie found herself jogging through what appeared to be a colonial settlement from the early days of European colonization in Australia. She saw people dressed in 18th and early 19th century clothing going about their daily tasks, tending animals, working in gardens, and conducting the business of survival in a harsh and unfamiliar environment. The most striking aspect of her experience was the complete transformation of the landscape itself. The modern city of Sydney had vanished entirely, replaced by the natural coastline and dense forest that had existed before urban development. Mackenzie could see sailing ships in the harbor where modern vessels should have been, their tall masts and billowing sails creating a scene from maritime history. Unlike other time-slip cases where individuals observe the past from a distance, Mackenzie felt completely integrated into the colonial environment. The dirt beneath her running shoes felt real and solid. She could smell the wood smoke from cooking fires and hear the sounds of axes cutting timber and livestock moving through the underbrush. When Mackenzie stopped running and tried to get her bearings, she realized she was lost in a version of Sydney that no longer existed. The familiar landmarks she used for navigation were absent. replaced by natural features and small settlements that belonged to Australia's colonial period. She had to rely on the position of the sun and her general sense of direction to find her way back to what she hoped would be her own time. The return to 1985 happened as gradually as her displacement to the past had occurred. Modern buildings slowly materialized among the colonial structures. Paved roads appeared beneath the dirt tracks, and the sounds of contemporary city life replaced the quieter rhythms of the 18th century settlement life. Mackenzie's experience lasted nearly 2 hours, during which she covered approximately 10 miles through colonial Sydney. When she arrived home, her family confirmed that she had been gone for the expected amount of time. But her description of the route she had taken led through areas that were heavily built-up modern neighborhoods with no resemblance to the colonial landscape she described. The Castle Siege. The 9th case involves a German tourist whose visit to a medieval castle became a journey into the building's violent past. In 1987, Klaus Weber was touring Heidelberg Castle with a group of other visitors when he became separated from the tour and found himself alone in a section of the ruins he didn't remember entering. Weber initially assumed he had simply wandered into a restricted area, but as he explored the stone corridors and chambers, he began to notice that the castle appeared to be in much better condition than it should have been. Walls that he knew were partially collapsed seemed solid and complete, and rooms that had been empty ruins now contained furniture, tapestries, and signs of active habitation. The transformation was so gradual that Weber didn't immediately realize what was happening. He thought perhaps he had entered a section of the castle that had been more extensively restored than other areas. But when he looked out a window, he saw the surrounding landscape as it had appeared centuries earlier, with dense forest where modern Heidelberg should have been and no sign of contemporary development. Weber found himself witnessing what appeared to be daily life in a medieval castle during its active period. He saw servants going about their duties, guards patrolling the battlements, and nobles conducting the business of feudal administration. The smells were overwhelming, a mixture of cooking food, unwashed bodies, animal waste, and the musty odors of stone buildings without modern ventilation or sanitation. Most disturbing was Weber's gradual realization that he was observing the castle during a period of siege or conflict. He heard the sounds of battle from the walls, saw wounded men being carried into the great hall, and witnessed preparations for defense that suggested imminent attack. The atmosphere was tense with fear and desperation as the castle's inhabitants prepared for what might be their final stand. Weber tried to leave the way he had entered, but the corridors seemed to have changed, leading him deeper into the castle rather than back toward the tourist areas. He became increasingly frightened as he realized he might be trapped in whatever temporal anomaly had transported him to the medieval period. The return to 1987 came suddenly and without warning. Weber found himself standing in the familiar ruins of Heidelberg Castle, surrounded by other tourists and tour guides who seemed unaware that anything unusual had occurred. When he checked his watch, he discovered that several hours had passed, though the tour group insisted he had only been missing for a few minutes. Weber's description of medieval castle life proved historically accurate when researchers examined his account. He described architectural features, social customs, and military practices that matched scholarly understanding of castle operations during periods of warfare, knowledge that would have required extensive study of medieval history to acquire through conventional means. We've covered 9 incredible time-slip cases, but the final story might be the longest temporal displacement ever recorded. Before we reveal it, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss future videos where we explore more mysteries that defy explanation. Now let's dive into our final case, the 1920s road trip. Our final case brings us back to England, where a couple's drive through the countryside became an encounter with their nation's past that challenged everything they believed about the nature of time itself. In 1996, Michael and Jane Harrison were driving through rural Gloucestershire when they took what they thought was a shortcut down a narrow country lane. The road led them through increasingly remote countryside, past farms and villages that seemed untouched by modern development. At first, the Harrisons were charmed by the authentic rural atmosphere, assuming they had discovered one of England's hidden gems, where traditional ways of life had been preserved. But as they continued driving, they began to notice details that suggested something more extraordinary than simple rural preservation. The farming techniques they observed were genuinely primitive, using methods and tools that had been abandoned decades earlier. The clothing worn by people working in the fields belonged to the early 20th century, and the vehicles they occasionally saw were vintage models that appeared to be in daily use rather than restored antiques. The Harrisons found themselves driving through what appeared to be England in the 1920s or 1930s, complete with period-appropriate agriculture, transportation, and social customs. They stopped at what appeared to be a village pub to ask for directions, but the interior was furnished and decorated in authentic early 20th century style, with prices posted in pre-decimal currency and beverages served in containers they hadn't seen since childhood. The other patrons in the pub were dressed in period clothing and engaged in conversations about concerns and events that belonged to decades past. When the Harrisons tried to pay for their drinks with modern money, the proprietor looked confused, but accepted the currency without comment, as if transactions involving unfamiliar coinage were routine occurrences. Most remarkably, the Harrisons spent nearly an entire day in this temporal pocket, driving from village to village and observing rural English life as it had existed generations earlier. They ate lunch at a country inn, purchased fuel at a garage where attendants hand-pumped petrol into glass containers, and even attended what appeared to be a village festival, complete with traditional music and dancing. When they finally found their way back to the main road, the modern world returned gradually, as if they were emerging from a dream. The villages they had visited were nowhere to be found on their map, and attempts to retrace their route led only to modern housing developments and industrial parks that bore no resemblance to the rural communities they had explored. The Harrisons' experience suggests that time slips might sometimes create extended periods of temporal displacement, allowing individuals to spend significant amounts of time in past eras rather than brief glimpses of historical moments. Their day-long journey through 1920s England provided them with comprehensive knowledge of period life that would have taken years of academic study to acquire through conventional research. What unites all these cases isn't just their extraordinary nature, but the profound impact they had on the people who experienced them. These weren't individuals seeking supernatural encounters or hoping to validate paranormal beliefs. They were ordinary people going about routine activities when reality itself seemed to malfunction around them, dropping them into moments that belonged to different centuries entirely. The psychological aftermath of time slip experiences follows remarkably consistent patterns across all documented cases. Witnesses describe an initial period of confusion and disbelief, followed by an overwhelming need to verify what they had experienced through historical research and documentation. Many spend years investigating their encounters, comparing their memories to archived records and historical accounts with the dedication of professional researchers. What emerges from this investigation is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of time slip phenomena. The historical accuracy displayed by witnesses proves consistently impossible to explain through conventional means. People describe architectural details, social customs, clothing styles, and even specific events with precision that would require extensive academic expertise to achieve through normal study. Yet most witnesses had no prior knowledge of the historical periods they claimed to have visited. The physical evidence accompanying time slip cases presents another layer of mystery that defies rational explanation. Objects brought back from temporal journeys, photographs that shouldn't exist, and knowledge that couldn't have been acquired through conventional means create a body of proof that skeptics struggle to dismiss entirely. While individual pieces of evidence might be questioned, the cumulative weight of documentation across multiple cases suggests something far more complex than mass hallucination or deliberate deception. Scientific attempts to explain time slip phenomena have produced theories that sound almost as extraordinary as the experiences themselves. Some researchers propose that consciousness might occasionally access what physicists call the block universe, where all moments in time exist simultaneously rather than in linear sequence. Under this model, time slips represent instances where human awareness temporarily expands beyond its normal temporal boundaries, allowing perception of past or future events. The consistency of witness descriptions across different cultures and time period provides compelling evidence that something genuine underlies these reports. People who have never heard of similar cases independently describe identical physical sensations, emotional responses, and environmental changes associated with temporal displacement. The universality of these descriptions suggests a phenomenon that transcends individual psychology or cultural conditioning. Perhaps most intriguing are the cases where multiple witnesses experience the same time slip simultaneously, as demonstrated by the English couples who discovered the Vanishing Hotel in France. These group experiences eliminate the possibility of individual hallucination or psychological episode, requiring explanations that account for shared displacement across multiple consciousnesses operating independently. These 10 people claim they fell out of time and experienced moments that shouldn't have been possible. But temporal anomalies aren't the only impossible things we've uncovered. In our previous video, 10 artifacts that shouldn't exist on Earth, we exposed physical objects that defy everything we know about history and technology. Ancient computers, prehistoric tools, and devices that demonstrate knowledge that shouldn't have existed thousands of years ago. Just like these time slips challenge our understanding of when events can occur, those artifacts prove that what we think we know about human history is fundamentally incomplete. Click the video on your screen right now to see the impossible objects that mainstream archaeology doesn't want you to know about. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next impossible mystery. Thanks for watching. Until next time, when we find out how.